but for some reason there is a notion among a lot of soldiers, so they actually expect the war to be ended. Like some of them even expect it to be ended in January, which might not be plausible, unfortunately. What do you think is that?
I hear the same thing from soldiers that you do. It's actually like important to me that what you are hearing is the same thing that I'm hearing. I mean, because like I said at the beginning, you're closer to this than I am, and so if you're hearing the same thing that I am, that's I take that as some confirmation. I think that expectation is unrealistic. The soldiers who I talk to are very tired. They're certainly not preparing to capitulate under any circumstances, but they would rather not be under artillery. And if there was a way to actually end the conflict, they would be the happiest of all about that. And I can only imagine what it's like, to look at the likely future. If I were in uniform, I don't know how I could imagine continuing doing what they do for another year or 2 years or 3 years. And so this is just psychological amateur speculation on my part. But I think a lot of the guys, are really looking for reasons to be hopeful. And the Biden administration's policies clearly were not going to end the war. Now that there's a change, there's at least a small chance that the change will be for the better. And I think a lot of guys are putting a lot of emotional investment into that pretty remote possibility that Trump is going to change things for the better. Trump is going to sit down and be tough with Putin and make sure Putin knows that if the war doesn't stop, then the United States is going to do all sorts of harmful things to Russia, and Putin's going to back down. It's a really nice idea. It's a really comforting idea. I don't believe it's true, but I can understand why a lot of guys have put a lot of faith into that hope. We'll see what happens. I hope they're right.
Yeah, me too. The war in Ukraine already led to a shift in Western understanding of Ukraine. Bucha, the events in Bucha, and the way Ukrainians were fighting against Russians. It was inconceivable, like in before that West can actually give F-16s to Ukraine, or like all these weapons that West is giving. Still, it's not enough actually it's enough to survive, it's enough to get by, but it's not enough to end it. So what should happen for bigger shift in Western understanding of Ukraine, so we would have actually NATO soldiers here, because this is the only way, and also a lot of soldiers who are in the front lines, they agree with this. This is the only way to actually end the war, is to have NATO presence here, not the promises, not any. You cannot win the war with Russia with papers. You can sign whatever you want, but only actual presence of NATO soldiers here can actually end this. So what can happen, for the West to understand it?
This is the most important question. And you started your question asking about what the West needs to understand about Ukraine in order to make this happen, in order to get NATO soldiers on the ground. But the issue is that the West needs to actually understand Russia. Unfortunately, the decision about whether or not to put Western boots on the ground has essentially nothing to do with Ukraine. It has everything to do with our fear in Washington about what Russia might do if we actually had, NATO troops in Kherson, like I described. You mentioned F-16s and all that other stuff. Ukraine certainly has received a lot of pretty high-profile Western weaponry over the course of this full-scale war. It's received all of it in quantities that were too small, and it's received all of it several months after it was most necessary. The administration, the outgoing administration, did this is my assessment, pretty terrible job of equipping and supplying Ukraine. And I don't think that the reason was because they misunderstood Ukraine. I think the main reason why that happened is because they misunderstood Russia. And throughout this entire full-scale war, people in Washington have been overly afraid about the prospect of Russian escalation. Even from the morning of February 24th, 2022, Putin was making nuclear threats that if anybody from the West intervened, the consequences would be unlike those you've seen in your history. That's a roughly direct quote of his speech from February 24th. And in the opening weeks of the full-scale invasion, he made several other veiled nuclear threats. And that really did delay the provision of necessary weaponry to Ukraine from the West. And that pattern continued itself. And there are a lot of people in this town where I am, not too far from where I live, who give themselves a lot of congratulations because, everybody said that Russia would escalate if we sent HIMARS. They said Russia would escalate if we sent tanks, if we sent F-16s, and we sent all that stuff, and we proved that all of Putin's nuclear bluster was only, bluster. It was rhetoric. It wasn't real. And the answer to all of those people in the outgoing administration who continue to congratulate themselves is no. Putin's nuclear bluffing, it actually worked. The reason why we don't have NATO troops on the ground is because that bluff and that bluster, it limited us. It didn't prevent us from sending everything, but it prevented us from doing everything that was necessary in order to actually end the war. Putin's rhetoric was enough to prevent Ukraine from receiving the necessary level of help that it would have needed in order to actually win this. We provided something, but not nearly enough. And the main reason, again, is because we didn't understand the extent to which Putin is a very capable manipulator. And I described at the beginning how he manipulated his own system. Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister, didn't know about the invasion. And again, I would allege that Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, was not fully informed about the invasion on February 23rd. In the same way, Putin manipulates Western public opinion about the prospects of World War III, and he manipulates Western leaders into believing that he's crazy and obsessed and willing to use nuclear weapons in the event that there's a NATO troop presence in Ukraine. And I think we are suckers to continue to fall for that. And even as we're falling for it, we continue to congratulate ourselves because we didn't fall for it completely. He said, give me $100. And we say, no. I'll give you 50. And we think we won that exchange. It's insane.
Okay.
But in order to end this, it's not about understanding of Ukraine. It's about understanding Russia and understanding that we actually need to call this bluff.
But if Putin, in some hypothetical situation, if Putin really will use nuclear weapon, West will use its nuclear weapon in return. So, actually, this is how nuclear weapon has been canceled even before it's been used, because the West is not going to okay, so you bombed us, and we'll just sit here and look what will happen.
I don't know what our response would be in the event. I mean, we can speak completely hypothetically. I think that if the 82nd Airborne was in Kherson, like I said before, Russian soldiers would stop firing artillery indiscriminately into Kherson, and they would stop hunting civilians with drones. I think that would be the result. I can imagine a scenario in which the result is, an artillery shell with a very low yield nuclear warhead falling in her sun. If that happens, I do not know what the response from the wider world would be. But what I'm saying is, I think we should actually call Putin's bluff and put him in the situation where he needs to make that decision. I think that's better for us than for him, and it's past time that we start putting him in much more difficult positions, because what we've done so far is not even close to sufficient.
And the last thing I want to say is that even the idea of having peace talks with Putin and the idea that some peace deal can be achieved with him, it's normalized. Like, so let's imagine the war has ended and we have a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. And what does it mean? So Putin is no longer responsible for all the war crimes he did in Ukraine. The Western sanction against Russia will be lifted, So, and the situation will be just normalized, and the very idea, of just having some peace talks with Putin, is like makes him normal again. It's like there was no these 3 years of the war crimes of 1,000 people just been killed, towns and cities were just obliterated. Apparently you can just have a talk after that, just sign something and everything will be okay. That's how it is. Seems to me.
I can't imagine a situation in which there's a peace deal and everything just goes back to normal. I don't think, one, it's achievable, and just it's impossible for me to actually imagine a scenario in which we just forget everything. If we could actually end the war and leave Putin in charge in Russia, because we don't have any say over that, I think that would be better than not doing it. I think if we could push a button and the fighting stops and Russia really is no longer attacking Ukrainian cities, but Putin and his circle are still in charge in Moscow, even if it meant reducing sanctions, which I can't imagine Western governments actually going for that. Even if it were possible, I think I would take that deal. Because it's better than the alternative, even though it's awful. But I can't imagine, a plausible scenario in which we end up at that result. I think that the worst, not the worst, but the worst, development is what's actually going to happen, which is a continuation of the status quo on a slightly lower military tempo for the foreseeable future. And by the foreseeable future, I mean 5-10 years even.
Yeah, I would like to finish, with some positive statement, but I don't think there is one. There is one,
I think there is one. I'll tell a little story. I was in Russia in the run-up to the war. My family and I left, and I started covering the war from Ukraine itself in the summer of 2022. And I would talk to people, and they would ask me what I thought, and I would say that what Russia is doing is the worst thing that a nation state has done since Hitler's Germany. And the response that I would get, from Ukrainians sometimes was, how can you say things like that? You're a journalist. You're supposed to be objective. Objectively speaking, what Putin has done, what Putin's Russia has done, it really is the worst thing that a nation state has done since Hitler's Germany. I mean, that's objective. And maybe, the one possible optimistic scenario that I can imagine is that we finally figure that out.